So peaceful, thank you. Yes, indeed. The Institute of Internal Auditors South Africa starting its annual conference in Joburg today. Discussions include the state of the industry, the impact of corruption and state capture. The last few years have seen what could be called audit failures at important state-owned entities and private companies. Many of those had to do with the Guptas and State Capture. Of course, they stand Steinhoff in the middle of that as well. Charles Nell is the acting CEO of the Institute. He's with me now. Charles, good evening. Thank you so much for coming in.
Good evening, Stephen, and thank you. Good evening to your viewers as well.
All right, so firstly, just explain this for us. We've got chartered accountants who do one thing. We have external auditors, well, let's use an example, KPMG. And then you've got internal auditors. I'm presuming internal auditors are the sort of line of first defense?
Yeah, we would like to see them as the third line of defense, with the external auditors as something outside. Management, of course, are your first line of defense, because they're the people who control the workers and the business. The second line of defense is risk management and all the compliance activities within the organization. And the third line of defense, internal auditors, those who look at the processes around the business, consider the designs of the controls, and give management and the audit committees and organizations outside a picture of how well the organization is running internally.
So would it be fair to say that the problems we've seen at Eskom or Steinhoff should have been picked up would have been picked up by internal auditors?
Yes, they should have been picked up. Probably some were picked up, but there's a capacity of whether management want to execute and correct what is wrong. And I think that's a very important issue. So sometimes you can hide stuff away from anybody within the organization. I think internal auditors have a huge role to play in exposing what is going on in the organization, looking at the control mechanisms and determining whether they work efficiently and effectively, and whether the design is correct. And it's in that space that internal auditors will report to the executive and to the boards. And whether action gets taken is another matter, and I think that's one of the issues that we have to deal with.
So then, why are problems not picked up? I mean, there must be case study after case study of mistakes that internal auditors should have picked up. What are the main reasons that problems aren't picked up by internal auditors? Or is it simply because their bosses don't listen to them?
Sometimes the bosses don't listen to them, and that is one of the issues. Sometimes the bosses don't want to listen to them because it's not convenient. But I really do believe that a lot of the issues were picked up and reported. And I think the one disadvantage that we've got as the Institute is that we don't have the regulatory framework to move into the organizational space. So we can't go and say, yes, this was reported to the board, but you didn't report it. So that would have to come from inside the organization, because remember, the internal auditors work for the organization. So they have to report up the channels to the organization. The external auditors, very often, you talk about external auditors, the chartered accountants who attest to the financial statements, have access to that information mostly, and they can also use that in their reporting and their decision making when they sign financial statements.
Is there supposed to be a relationship between internal auditors and external auditors? As someone who has nothing to do with auditing as a journalist, it's tempting to suggest that if I'm an internal auditor and I come across a problem, I'd immediately tell the external auditor about it. But I could imagine there might be a reason why I'm not supposed to communicate with the external auditor, because I'm not supposed to influence their view as well.
That is, you can consider it like that. However, the internal audit standards do require that internal auditors do approach and discuss with external audit what the issues are in the organization, especially if they're not being fixed. In addition, if the external auditors have picked up something, internal audit can ensure that the organization actually addresses, well, it can't ensure, but can direct and test whether the organization is addressing those issues. So they work closely together in the same way that the audit committee should have in-camera sessions with the head of internal audit of an organization, and make sure that he's not being inhibited by his management from giving the real truth to the audit committee.
Can you imagine that the relationship between a CEO and the head of internal audit must be fascinating?
It's tense at times. I think I've come from that environment, and you can get quite tense relationships, but it also builds a huge amount of trust when you are in a position as an internal auditor to be able to talk to the executive and they realize the value that you bring in to that space. It's also important in that space so that internal auditors look to the future and apply their minds very, very effectively to what is happening within the organization, the outside environment. And obviously we're looking at a state in the economy and so on where it's very difficult, and the volume of change that we're going through is daily in most organizations. Very difficult to deal with and keep a view and an independent view of what's going to happen in the future and to provide foresight. But if we look at the principles of internal audit, the one issue that has come up is internal auditors need to provide insight and foresight. So insight into why the organization has issues facing it, and secondly, why there is, what the outcome could be for the organization, and then suggest corrective action. I think the challenge for internal auditors is that you can see what the problems are, but you don't manage the change. You have to work that change through somebody else. So it's a political position within an organization.
After everything that we've seen with audit failures, I mean, there's been a lot of sort of, you know, inward looking by the chartered accountants. They've been looking at themselves. KPMG has suffered a sort of punishment, if you like. Do you feel, you know, as the Institute, do you feel embarrassed by what's happened with all of the audit problems we've had? Or do you think it was something the external auditors should have fixed?
I think it's a combination of a number of areas. I don't think it's just what the external auditors have fixed. I don't think they're in a position to fix anything either. They're merely reporting on the state that they find. A lot of things can be hidden away by the executive. I think if we look at integrated reporting, for instance, I think part of the issue is that the report doesn't reflect what is really going on in the organization. We spoke today about an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is the integrated report. That's what the public sees about the organization. However, outside or inside the organization, there's a heck of a lot going on under the water. And it's in that space that internal auditors need to make sure that the problems are raised. However, if you don't have the support of the executive and the audit committee, are you going to achieve your objectives as an audit function? I don't think so.
So to be an internal auditor, you don't just need to be good at maths, you need to have a really thick skin as well.
A very thick one, and one which is able to look at processes and turn those processes into value and money. So you've got to make the link between the process and the eventual output.
As the acting CEO of the Institute, do you think the problems and mistakes we've seen in the auditing profession could still be made again? Or do you think there's been enough change to, you know, do you think people are more on the alert? Maybe CEOs have, you know, sort of harnessed their ambitions a little. Do you think that, or do you think that the same problems could just still happen again?
If we've watched over the world over a number of years, United States, we had Sarbanes-Oxley implemented, and then it was brought back a little bit and lightened up. I think in South Africa we're at a stage where we are probably going to have a bit more regulation coming in, a bit tougher stance. There will be, I'm sure, some effects, and the sanction against KPMG by the public and organizations was quite significant in the right direction, I think. So yes, I think we are going to have a time when it's going to have a little bit more regulation and a little bit more tightening up. And then once the principles start working and the ethics start working again, effectively, I think we're going to have an easier ride and a more progressive development economic development for the country.
Charles Nell, thank you very much indeed. Charles Nell is the acting CEO of the Internal Audit Institute of South Africa. Stay with us, plenty more to come, and of course keeping a very close eye on that meeting in KwaZulu-Natal at the moment. Stay with us.